Today we are talking about the Obama years, basically 2009 through 2017, Obama's 8 years in office. So first off, Barack Obama was exceptional in many ways. He was very unique as a candidate. There were several things that made Obama different from previous African Americans who had run for president in the past. For example, one prominent African American who had run for president both in 1984 and 1988, Jesse Jackson, and also Al Sharpton, who ran for president in 2004. Both of these men focused almost solely on racial issues in their campaign. Their speeches accentuated race in America, and racial messages were very central in all of their speeches and proposed policies. Now, Barack Obama was very different. He, in fact, rarely talked about race. Some would say he didn't, quote, play the race card, if we want to use that term. But in the speech that he made that made him famous back in 2004, he declared, quote, "There is not a white America and a black America. There is a United States of America." And this was refreshing to many voters. Now, there are a lot of reasons why millions of voters supported Obama. First, he was a very articulate speaker, a very inspiring speaker, one of the best we've ever had in the White House in that regard. Also, his policies were very different from the sitting president, George W. Bush, who, as we talked about last time, had become quite unpopular by 2008. Also, his campaign slogans were very simple, very positive about our country's future, things like change, hope, yes we can. And also, many people simply wanted to prove that a black man could, in fact, hold the highest office in the land and show how far we had come as a country. But there were also some things that made Barack Obama controversial to many voters. First off, he was voted the most left-wing member of the U.S. Senate, and Americans tend to vote more towards the middle. He also had supported partial birth abortion during his time as an Illinois senator. And this is something that's extremely unpopular even among most pro-choice people. He also only had 4 years of experience in political office, and some say that you should have more experience before becoming president. And then he also had a couple of controversial friends. For example, he was friends with a man named William Ayers, who had been an active domestic terrorist in a group called the Weather Underground back in the 1970s. In which he bombed several buildings and advocated for, quote, killing the rich. In addition to that, Obama's pastor, named Jeremiah Wright, would give fiery sermons in which he would make controversial statements such as, you can see on the screen there, "God blank America." And while Obama himself never said these things, the fact that he had friends who did gave him, made a lot of voters hesitant to vote for him. So the results of the election of 2008 was that Obama decisively won, largely due to the malaise in the country over President Bush and the Republican Party, who had fallen out of favor with most voters by that point. Obama decisively defeated his opponent, John McCain, who didn't even ask George W. Bush to endorse him, which shows how unpopular he had become. The Democratic Party also took control of the House and the Senate by 2008, making the Democratic Party very powerful for the next couple years. Now, in keeping with tradition, President Bush did not publicly criticize Obama, but graciously aided in the peaceful transfer of power. And in response, Obama had many positive things to say about Bush in the years that followed. And the Bushes and Obamas remain close friends to this day, even though they sharply disagree on politics. Obama was inaugurated in January of 2009 and served as president for 8 years until January 2017. Now, upon entering office in 2009, one of the biggest issues on people's minds was the economy. The economy was in shambles. The housing market had just crashed 1 year prior, and the stock market was in collapse. And so Obama's plan to bring the economy back was called the stimulus package, also known as the Recovery Act. And this was an $800 billion bailout program in which the federal government gave billions of dollars to failing companies and failing banks to keep them afloat, keep them from going bankrupt. Now, this was controversial for a couple of reasons. One, because it bailed out the companies that were partially responsible for the recession in the first place. And so some people said, well, they didn't learn their lesson. This is going to happen again if you reward them. and it also dramatically increased the national debt. What followed was a very slow but steady economic improvement over the course of Obama's 8 years in office. The economy never really boomed under Obama, but it didn't tank either, and it slowly, steadily grew during his 8 years. Now, as far as foreign policy goes, upon becoming president, Obama had vowed to end the Iraq War and to remove our troops by the end of his first term. When he had taken office, the U.S. had been in Iraq for almost 6 years at that point. So on December 15th, 2011, he did just that. He officially ended the Iraq War after 8 years and removed the last of our combat troops. Now, at first, this seemed to be a very good thing. I mean, who doesn't want an end to a war? However, since the U.S. had not yet completed its goal of replacing Saddam Hussein's former government with a stable republic, the American departure actually left a power vacuum in which no one was officially in charge, no stable government was in charge, you should say, and because of that, you have extremist groups all trying to take power in that power vacuum. The void was then filled by a newly formed radical Islamic group known as ISIS. Well, who is ISIS? Well, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was the most harmful group of the 2010s. They wreaked havoc upon many sections of the world and ruined the lives of untold thousands of people. It was founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and the ISIS Caliphate committed mass murder, mass rape, torture, and even slavery. Christians were beheaded by ISIS. They were also crucified and burned to death. Homosexuals were thrown off buildings. Thousands of Yazidi women, which is an ethnic group in Iraq and Syria, were forced into sexual slavery. And in addition to committing atrocities against the people within their caliphate, which was quite sizable at one time, they also carried out numerous terrorist attacks across the globe throughout the 2010s. In addition to ISIS taking over in Iraq and Syria, you also have the Arab Spring taking place in 2011-2012. So in 2011, this movement began in Tunisia, and it was a series of revolutions in various Arab countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Two of the largest revolutions took place in Egypt and Libya, and these revolts often resulted in rebels overthrowing their country's longtime leaders. These were extremely violent movements. These rebellions led to the downfall of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, who had been essentially a dictator in Egypt for close to 30 years at that point. It also led to the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi, who had been the dictator of Libya for about 30 years at that point. President Obama decided to stay out of most of the Arab Spring, but he said that we should get involved in Libya. So he involved the U.S. specifically in the revolution occurring in Libya to support the rebels over Muammar Gaddafi. So in 2011, when Libyan rebels revolted against Gaddafi, the Obama administration funded and assisted the rebels in doing so. Once this happened, the U.S. then helped the Libyans form a new government, and U.S. forces occupied Libya for about a year. Now, this was the first time in all of U.S. history that America had ever been involved in 3 wars at once, and those 3 wars would be Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But then, on September 11th, 2012, the American office in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked by radical Islamic terrorists. Now, this resulted in the deaths of 4 Americans, including the death of the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens. Both President Obama and his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, received a lot of criticism after Benghazi, as some believed that they did not send in support fast enough that could have saved those 4 American lives. Now, in an effort to make healthcare more affordable domestically, Obama devoted a lot of his domestic policy to bringing about a universal healthcare system. This was known as the Affordable Care Act, and it was more commonly known as Obamacare. Now, some say that the government shouldn't be involved in medicine, while others say, no, it's necessary for government to be involved in medicine, especially for those who can't afford insurance. Now, Obamacare was good for some and bad for others, and that's what made it controversial. One thing it did is that it lowered coverage and raised premiums for the middle class, but it did make health insurance more affordable for the poor. So it tended to be that if you were in the poor sector, you benefited from Obamacare, but the middle class was harmed by it. The most controversial part of Obamacare was the mandate that it had, which forced all health insurance providers to pay for contraceptives, like birth control pills, for example. And this goes against the religious beliefs of certain groups that provide health insurance, especially Roman Catholic groups. Now, the Little Sisters of the Poor was one group that provided health insurance, basically a group of Catholic nuns, and it was against their religious principles to provide birth control. Therefore, they sued the federal government and won at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no, healthcare companies should not be forced to violate their consciences and provide things that they are morally opposed to. And the future of Obamacare is still in question at this time. In 2010, the U.S. experienced one of the worst environmental disasters in our nation's history. It was called the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, more commonly called the BP oil spill, and this was in the Gulf of Mexico. An oil rig off the coast of Louisiana exploded, and this caused oil to gush into the ocean continuously for weeks. It could not be stopped for weeks. And it resulted in a total of 5 million barrels of oil being released into the ocean. So tens of millions of gallons of oil wasted, and also harming the ocean, harming the wildlife, the animals of that area. It also ruined many beaches and harmed a lot of industries along the Gulf Coast. In 2012, you have another tragedy occurring, and this was at an elementary school in Connecticut called Sandy Hook School. And this was a mass shooting that killed 26 people, most of them 5- and 6-year-olds. Now, this heart-wrenching event caused Obama and a lot of his supporters, especially Democrats, to push for gun control for the remainder of his presidency, believing that that would be the solution to stopping school shootings. Now, Obama also changed his stance on racial issues around this time. Remember, he hardly ever mentioned race in the first term of his presidency. But in his second term, you have 2 shootings of unarmed young black men. In 2013 and in 2012, you have the shootings of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. And he made statements on these that emphasized the race of both of the victims of the shootings. And this was the first time that he did so in his presidency. At this time, you also have the group Black Lives Matter forming, and they began to protest police brutality, sometimes peacefully and sometimes violently. 2014 to 2016 also saw an increase in terrorist attacks carried out or supported by ISIS. The most tragic example of this in America happened in Orlando in 2016, in which 49 people were killed and 53 people were wounded by an ISIS shooter. And they were specifically targeted by ISIS for being gay, because it was a gay nightclub. There were also many ISIS attacks in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East in the 2010s. Paris, in particular, was a site where you had multiple terrorist attacks occurring. And then finally, in 2019, the ISIS caliphate was destroyed. Their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed, but radical Islamic terrorism does remain a threat today. In 2011, you also have an event causing a stir across America, in which you have a drug bust of an abortion clinic in Philadelphia. And during this drug bust, federal authorities uncovered the fact that abortionist Kermit Gosnell had not only been performing abortions to babies inside the womb, but he had actually been killing babies after they were born by snipping their spinal cords at the neck with a pair of scissors. Now, he had been committing these murders for 17 years, and investigators estimate that his victims numbered close to 1,000 babies killed after they were born. Now, in addition to the babies that he killed, his barbaric methods also led to the deaths of 2 women who came to his facility for this procedure to be done. Now, when this was finally uncovered, Gosnell was sentenced to life in prison. So Obama was asked about this since he was president, and it was very well known how pro-choice he was. And when asked about the trial, he declined to comment on it since it was ongoing. But he said that if Gosnell had performed illegal abortions, then he should be prosecuted. But a couple days later, Obama then reaffirmed his support for abortion and spoke at a Planned Parenthood event. You also have a landmark Supreme Court ruling occurring during Obama's presidency. When Obama became president, when he ran the first time, he was against gay marriage. Every president had been in our history. And at the end of his first term in 2012, he made the announcement that he had, quote, evolved on the issue and came out in support of gay marriage as the first president to ever do so. And this supported the Supreme Court case of Obergefell when it happened. So it was the Supreme Court that made gay marriage legal, not the president or any state. Before Obergefell versus Hodges in June of 2015, same-sex marriage was a state-by-state issue. Some states allowed it, others did not. And what Obergefell versus Hodges did is it changed the legal definition of marriage by stating that the right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples in the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment talks about the rights of citizenship and due process. 5 Supreme Court justices voted for it, and 4 voted against it, which caused it to pass into law. Now, in 2015, Obama and his Secretary of State, John Kerry, signed a controversial nuclear deal with Iran. And this gave Iran $100 billion in exchange for a promise to reduce their uranium stockpile and to also never develop a nuclear bomb. So according to the U.S. intelligence community, Iran is one of the 4 global security threats. Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They have sponsored terrorist attacks that have killed many Americans and countless other innocent people. They even celebrate Death to America Day every November 4th. They promise to wipe out Israel, who they call the Little Satan, and they call America the Great Satan. And to make matters worse, they are trying to develop a nuclear bomb. So Obama and his Secretary of State, John Kerry, essentially were trying to solve the problem of how do we keep Iran from developing a nuclear bomb? And they came to the conclusion that if we give them $100 billion in exchange for a promise they will never develop a bomb and that they will reduce their uranium stockpiles, which could be used to produce a bomb, then that would reduce the risk of them creating a nuclear bomb. This was later, the U.S. later withdrew from the Iran deal under Donald Trump. In 2016, Obama also mandated that public schools allow transgender students to use the bathroom that they choose. And then also, you have a handful of other, I guess we could say controversial. I've been using that term a lot, but a lot of these were and remain controversial decisions. Some love it, some hate it, and you can make up your own mind on that. But the statement on transgenderism was a break with tradition, making him the first, but not the last, president to support that policy. So in the end, to assess President Obama, he was very intelligent, very respectable, and he did what he believed was right. He had very good motives. However, when he left office, the U.S. did seem to be more divided than it had been in the past 50 years. Now, it's not necessarily all his fault, but questions remain as to what could have been done to prevent that. He remains a hero on the left, while the right views his presidency as kind of a well-intentioned failure that, despite his best efforts, left America and the world more divided and less safe.